Hello everyone, Honor here, back with another build guide, this time for Sentinel Titan. We're going to be going in depth with, once again, a PvE oriented build that's designed to take on a wide variety of content, everything from regular patrol and strikes, all the way up to difficult endgame content like the 980 power level Nightfall The Ordeal. Now, I want to start off by saying that one of the primary driving factors in this build is fun. I'm aware that you might get partway through the video after seeing some of the build and think to yourself, this might not be the most optimal choice for high tier endgame content. But, having said that, I want to say that I've tested this in the Master Level Nightfall, I've tested it in Master Difficulty Nightmare Hunts, and I've even tested it in some of the encounters of the Garden of Salvation raid, and I can say that it holds its own in each of those situations. This build is going to be primarily intended for team play. It can function as a solo, but it's really going to shine in a coordinated team. So this is going to be a very in-depth guide, and actually a fairly long one. We're going to be talking about all of the armor and components and the armor mods. We're going to be talking about the recommended weapons, and we're going to be definitely spending some time breaking down the moment-to-moment gameplay. So without further ado, let's get medieval. So when Shadowkeep launched, Bungie introduced a quality of life change intended to allow players who use the hold to sprint option to be able to use the Tempest Strike melee ability on Arc Hunters, which was previously only usable by players using the toggle to sprint option. Now this quality of life change had the unintended side effect of allowing Titans to be able to squeeze in a gunshot right before their shoulder charge impact. So Titans were able to combine the buffs from a 1-2 punch shotgun, the Peregrine Greaves exotic Titan legs, and the shoulder ability on Solar Titans to do upwards of 250,000 damage with a single knee, which is enough damage to one-shot nearly any non-boss enemy in the game, including any type of champion in the 980 power level Nightfalls. And so during the first couple weeks of Shadowkeep, when people were farming the Nightfalls, some people were playing it safe with Divinity and Izanagi, and other people, including myself, were enjoying the risk/reward of just running straight headfirst into champions and smashing them off the face of the planet with our knees. Now, inevitably, Bungie caught wind of this bug and announced a planned fix for the patch that was supposed to drop on October 29th, 2019. That patch arrived and fixed the bug and eliminated Titan's ability to one-shot high health enemies in endgame content. So ever since then, I've been looking for a replacement. And the replacement build, called Excalibur Titan, is going to be centered on the combination of the exotic gauntlets, Stronghold, and the Titan class exclusive sword, Cleaver. Now with the help of Void Grenades featuring the Oppressive Darkness mod, you're going to be able to output high burst damage that can one-shot champions, some strike bosses, and other high health enemies in just about any activity. First, we're going to talk about the armor and the mods in particular, as they are very important to this build, and then we're going to dive into everything you need to know about swords and about the Throne Cleaver sword in particular. So first up, Stronghold. These exotic arms are from the Joker's Wild DLC from Year 2 of Destiny 2. Its exotic perk is Clenched Fist, which increases your movement speed while blocking with a sword and allows you to block damage without consuming sword ammo. Additionally, receiving damage within 1 second of activating a sword block will also heal you. This exotic can be obtained as a random world drop or from Xur on the weekends if he's selling it. And having spent several weeks so far consistently using this exotic in endgame content, using this armor is the only time in Destiny 2 that I have ever truly felt like my Titan is really a tank. I've used it to be able to cover dangerous reses for teammates out in the open. I've used it to panic heal to full health from critical health, and I've used it to shield allies from damage that otherwise might have killed them. And although I can say that there is a bit of learning curve when it comes to utilizing this exotic to its full potential and learning the timing on that block, it's well worth the grind to do that and learn that skill. The first mod on the table we're going to talk about is, of course, Oppressive Darkness. Now this is a class item perk from the 5th and final column of the Season of Undying artifact. It reads, causing damage with a Void Grenade adds a weaken effect to enemies, and this weaken effect is a debuff that's going to apply to any enemy damaged by your Void Grenade. The debuff lasts for 5 seconds and causes the enemy to take an additional 30% damage from any source, including the grenade itself. And because this debuff is based on causing damage, it can last the entire duration of the grenade, plus an additional 5 seconds afterwards if the enemy stays within the damage radius of your grenade the entire time. And this is a 6 cost mod that can apply to any class item regardless of polarity. Now, depending on the difficulty level of the activity you're in, you may or may not need the debuff from the Oppressive Darkness grenade to boost your sword damage so that you can take down beefy targets. And so to facilitate regenerating grenades quickly, so you'll always have one available when you need it, we're going to make use of this following combination of mods, which you may be familiar with. Breach Refractor and Anti-Barrier Rounds. So Breach Refractor is a 4th column mod from the Season of Undying artifact that reads, grants grenade energy on final blows with shield-piercing weapons, or when a member of your fire team shuts down a barrier champion's ability. It costs 3 energy to apply, and can be applied to any chess piece regardless of elemental polarity. Anti-Barrier Rounds is a 2nd column mod for the Season of Undying artifact that reads, shield-piercing rounds designed to bypass combatant defensives, strong against barrier champions. Now, anti-barrier rounds can be applied to hand cannons, submachine guns, and auto rifles. And with these anti-barrier rounds and breach refractor combined, 11 kills will get you your grenade back from empty. And if you're using a weapon with the demolitionist perk on it, you can get your grenade back from empty in as little as 6 kills. So these two combination of mods will allow us to regenerate our grenades quickly so that we can always have one available if we need to take down a high health target. Now, there are some alternatives to the anti-barrier breach refractor combo. You can use the following combination instead, or in addition to this combo, to get your grenade back as fast as possible. These mods that I'm going to talk about are the repurposing mods, and these are enemy-specific mods that will instantly grant you your grenade energy when you break the enemy shield. And the enemy shield is going to refer to elemental shields, so that arc, solar, or void shields that you see on enemies sometimes. And it's also going to apply to the shield that the barrier champions put up. When you break that, this mod will activate as well. And so there are 3 versions of this mod that are currently in the game: Taken Repurposing, Fallen Repurposing, and Hive Repurposing, applying to each of those enemies in particular: Taken, Fallen, and Hive. Now, it's important to note that these mods come from a particular source. Taken Repurposing can only come from the Last Wish raid. Fallen Repurposing can only come from the Scourge of the Past raid. And Hive Repurposing can only come from either the Crown of Sorrows raid or from Heroic Menagerie. And the other thing that you need to know about these repurposing mods is they can only be slotted into armor from their corresponding activities. So for example, Hive Repurposing can only be applied to armor from Crown of Sorrows or armor from the Menagerie. Now, because this build revolves around the consistent use of a sword, it's also important to take advantage of sword-specific mods. And they're really critical to this build. So in this section, we're going to talk about what these sword mods do and why you want them. So the first up on the table is Sword Ammo Finder. Now this is a 2-cost helmet armor mod. It's specific to arc polarity. And you can find this as a random drop from turning in tokens to vendors in the tower, or you can buy it from Banshee if he's selling it. His mod selection does rotate daily. And these ammo finder perks are actually incredibly consistent. And so you'll see the little ammo finder buff pop up on the left side of your screen when it activates. And it'll drop a special brick with a little extra glow on the center of the brick to differentiate from natural brick drops. And so if you look at, say, a heavy ammo brick for swords that drops from this perk, they'll have a little glow in the center. And if you look at a normal brick that drops just randomly, it won't have that glow in the center. So that's how you can tell the perk is working. And the reason you're going to want this perk, obviously, is so that you can get as much sword ammo as possible. You can always have sword ammo available to you because you're going to be using the sword a lot in this build. The next mod we're going to talk about is Sword Scavenger. Now, Sword Scavenger is a 2-cost leg armor mod, again specific to the arc polarity. And this perk is going to boost the amount of ammo that you can get when you pick up a brick of ammo from the ground. So with this perk equipped, the special bricks that drop from the Sword Ammo Finder perk will give 18 ammo per brick, and natural heavy ammo drops will give 30 ammo per brick. And so using the Sword Scavenger in combination with Sword Ammo Finder means you're going to be finding sword ammo a lot. You'll almost have too much ammo is going to be the problem. You won't be able to use enough of the sword to kill enough enemies before you have ammo drop again. And so like the Sword Ammo Finder mod, Sword Scavenger can be obtained from buying it from Banshee if he's selling it during the day, or as a random drop from turning in tokens to vendors in the tower. The third sword mod we're going to talk about is Sword Reserves. Now this perk I find is one of the optional perks. You can easily swap this out to make room for the anti-barrier breach refractor combo that I talked about previously, because I don't think that this perk is absolutely necessary. Swords already have a fairly high ammo count, and we're going to talk about later why you might want to have a smaller ammo count for your sword. And so this mod, Sword Reserves, is a 2-cost mod that goes on chest armor. Like all the other sword mods, it's specific to arc polarity. You can actually stack this mod up to 2 times, and each copy of Sword Reserves will give an additional 4 ammo to your reserves. And like the previous mods, you'll be able to get this mod by buying it from Banshee in the tower if he's selling it, or from turning in tokens to vendors in the tower as a random drop. Now, sword usage by nature will mean that you're often going to be in enemies' faces, and so while you can use the Stronghold exotic to tank damage and to heal, eventually you're going to need to stop blocking to actually swing that sword. And during that moment, you're going to be vulnerable. So I'm going to recommend the following mods to reduce the damage you take so that you can safely swing that sword without dying. The first mod on the table is Minor Resist. This is a 1-cost mod that can be applied to any armor piece, regardless of polarity. It reads, gain extra damage resistance against rank and file combatants. And what that translates to is a 10% damage reduction against any enemies with a red health bar. Now, similar to that mod, we have the Major Resist mod, another 1-cost mod that can be applied to any armor piece regardless of polarity. And this one is going to give you 10% damage reduction against powerful combatants. What are powerful combatants? Powerful combatants are any enemies with an orange health bar or non-boss enemies with a yellow health bar. And so the way you tell the difference between a boss enemy and a non-boss enemy with a yellow health bar is the non-boss enemies will have just a full yellow non-segmented health bar. Boss health bars generally are broken into thirds or sometimes quarters. And just like those 2 mods, then that brings us to the next mod, Boss Resist. Now, Boss Resist is a 2-cost mod that can be applied to any armor piece, regardless of polarity. And this is going to give you 10% damage reduction against any bosses. And so the important thing to know about Minor Resist, Major Resist, and Boss Resist is these mods don't stack. So you only want 1 copy of each. Now, if you're really looking to boost your tankiness and survivability when using this build, you can also take advantage of barrier mods. Barrier mods are very similar to the repurposing mods that I mentioned previously. These are enemy specific and will give you a 20% reduction in damage taken for 10 seconds after being damaged by the corresponding enemy type. There's no cooldown on this buff, so that means after the 10 seconds when the buff ends, it can immediately reactivate if you take damage again. And so there's currently 3 versions of this mod that are in the game: Taken Barrier, Fallen Barrier, and Hive Barrier for those Taken enemies, the Fallen enemies, and the Hive enemies. And like the repurposing mods, these come from very specific sources. Taken Barrier only comes from the Last Wish raid, Fallen Barrier only comes from the Scourge of the Past raid, and Hive Barrier can only come from Crown of Sorrows or from the Menagerie. And similar to repurposing, they also can only be slotted into armor from the corresponding activities. So, for example, Taken Barrier can only be slotted into armor from the Dreaming City or from the Last Wish raid. Alright, that is it for the mod section and the armor exotic section, and let's move on to the other half of the build. So let's talk about swords for a little bit. Now, if you're a Destiny 2 veteran like me, you might remember swords in their initial iteration as just a terrible weapon type. They used to have a max ammo size of 20-something, they did terrible damage, and they were basically a shadow of what they used to be in Destiny 1. Times have changed. Sword max ammo size now sits at around 50 to 60, and you can get up to 70 with double reserves. The swords have significant damage increasing perks, which we'll get into in a little bit, and they have their dedicated exotic armor in Stronghold. And with the introduction of Armor 2.0 in Shadowkeep, we now have a way to build around swords to make them a viable, consistent source of damage. Now, a few of you might still not believe me yet, so let's talk about some common misconceptions with swords. The first one being that swords are bad at damage. Now, currently, grenade launchers are the undisputed kings of damage in the heavy slot, so let's see how swords stack up to them. Now, a single shot from an aggressive frame grenade launcher with the spike grenade perk, which gives you increased damage on direct hits, will do about 20,000 damage. And swords have 2 different kinds of attacks, a light attack and a heavy attack. The light attack deals 18,000 damage, and the heavy attack deals 24,000 damage. So, it's pretty comparable. Now, if you want to get into the real details, yes, a grenade launcher does fire a lot faster than a sword can swing. So grenade launcher DPS is going to be significantly higher until you factor in reloading. And since we no longer have instant reloading in the game, if you factor in even just one reload, it'll take down the grenade launcher DPS from being 2.5 times higher than swords to only about 1.2 times higher. So a basic perkless sword is not going to out DPS a grenade launcher, but it's not too far off. But if we're going to talk about total damage capacity, nothing in the game is going to beat a sword. A standard grenade launcher gets around 16 shots. 16 shots times 20,000 damage is around 320,000 total damage. Meanwhile, a standard sword with, let's say, 54 ammo is going to swing for 18,000 damage per swing for light swings, and that leaves you with 972,000 total damage. So swords have the best ammo efficiency in the game among heavy weapons. You can get the most damage out of them over a long period of time because you have so much ammo and each swing does a decent amount of damage. Now the other misconception is that it's hard to deal damage with a sword, especially to bosses, because all bosses have a stomp mechanic. So you might think that the stomp mechanic actually counters sword usage. But that's false. It's actually the other way around. Swords countered the boss stomp mechanic. And if you're blocking with the sword as the boss stomps, you will not get knocked back. Now normally when you're blocking with a sword, it'll consume 5 sword ammo when you take that damage from the boss's stomp. But if you're using the Stronghold exotic with this build, you will not be using any ammo when you block. So now that you know you can get up close and personal to bosses and you can block that stomp mechanic, you should have no problem getting in there and dealing damage with swords. So now that we've debunked the two main myths about sword usage, let's get to talking about the actual sword that's the main feature of this build, and that's Throne Cleaver. So this sword was introduced in the Penumbra DLC in Year 2 of Destiny 2. This is a Titan class specific sword, meaning it can only be equipped and used on a Titan. It cannot be equipped on a Warlock, it cannot be equipped on a Hunter. It's also special because it's the only aggressive frame sword in the game. And what that means is the heavy attack animation is going to be different than the normal swords that you might be used to. Instead of an uppercut swing from the heavy attack, it's a downward slam. The other distinguishing factor about Throne Cleaver from other swords is that it's capable of rolling with 2 damage boosting perks instead of just 1. And those 2 damage dealing perks is going to allow it to deal the highest burst damage out of any heavy weapon in the game. So what perks are we looking for on Throne Cleaver? Well, the first one is called Shattering Blade, and Shattering Blade is a 200% damage buff if the heavy attack from the sword consumes the last of your sword ammo. And the other buffs you might be looking for in a combo with Shattering Blade is going to be either On Guard or Counter Attack. Both of them give the same amount of damage buff, just in different ways. So On Guard gives a 50% damage buff that lasts for 1 second after you swap to the sword from another weapon. And Counter Attack is a 50% damage buff that lasts for 5 seconds after blocking any damage. And comboing one of those 2 perks with the Shattering Blade buff is going to allow you to do over 100,000 damage in a single heavy attack. And a heavy attack takes less than a second. So this is the highest single burst damage in the game in that moment. And so coincidentally, champions in high endgame content in 980 at 980 power, at 950 power, have 100,000 health. So, with this build, Titans are back to one-shotting these guys after all. We finally get our chance to replace the Peregrine Greaves combo that got patched out. Now, where do you get Throne Cleaver from? Throne Cleaver is only obtainable from Heroic Menagerie, and if you've never done a Heroic Menagerie before at all on any of your characters, you are guaranteed a sword drop on your very first completion. So if you're a brand new player or you've never touched the Heroic version of Menagerie, if you go into it on your Titan, you will be guaranteed to get a Throne Cleaver drop from completing the Heroic Menagerie from the boss kill. If you go on there on one of your other characters, on a Warlock or on a Hunter, you'll get the sword for them, and then after that you'll have to rely on the drop chance to get a sword. You will not get it's not guaranteed per character, it is only guaranteed 1 time per account. So the drop rate for swords after that first time from completing the Menagerie is 25% chance from defeating the final boss. And so that might not seem like a whole lot, but the good news is that Throne Cleaver has a fairly small perk pool. And since there's two different roles of the sword that can function with this build, either you get Shattering Blade and counterattack, or you get Shattering Blade and on guard, you have a pretty good chance of actually getting the sword that you want. Um, with the perks that you can get in each column, um, getting the desired sword drop is about a 1 in 6 chance of being either one of the two combinations that you want. And if you combine that with the 25% drop rate, you should be able to get the desired sword in 24 completions or less. And 24 completions of Heroic Menagerie might sound like kind of a lot, but it's actually a lot better of a drop rate than many of the other desirable weapons in the game, like some of the raid exotics that even a veteran player like myself has not had a chance to get, even after many, many raid completions. So get out there, get in those heroic menageries, and try and farm for this sword. For me, to get this sword, I think it took somewhere about 18 completions of heroic menagerie to get it, but I had people that I was running with that got it in much, much less. I had a clanmate that got it, I think, on maybe his third or fourth try, and another friend that got it on, I think, completion number 11 or 12. So you might get lucky and get it, but you should be able to, at the very least, get it within 24 completions or less, given the drop rate and the likelihood of being the perks that you want. Now, in terms of what other weapons to pair with this sword, to be perfectly honest, you're really free to use whatever weapons you feel most comfortable with in the other two slots. You're going to be using the sword a lot anyways as your primary source of damage, so you really can put whatever you like in the other two slots to fit whatever activity that you're going to be doing. That loadout might change depending on what activity you're doing, whether you know you're going to be dealing with champions or not, or whether you're just a fan of certain other weapons or not in certain activities. Now, if you're interested in my personal loadout, typically I run a short-range energy primary, which is either a hand cannon or an SMG, and then I also like to run a kinetic sniper, just in case there's enemies that I can't attack easily with a sword, like Hive Shriekers or Fallen Servitors. So finally, let's get into the gameplay and how to actually use this build. So the first thing we're going to talk about is sword blocking, because learning how to effectively block with the sword is going to be one of the most critical elements to actually using this build. Now, sword blocking by default is bound to the same key as melee, which means that you're not going to be able to use your melee ability while you have the sword out. And it also means that for those of you who have changed your keybinds away from the default or changed your button mapping away from the default, you may want to check that you actually have this action bound. It's also important to know that you're not invincible while you block with the sword. Sword blocking reduces the amount of damage that you take by a significant amount, but you can still be overwhelmed. If you're facing large groups of enemies, the sheer amount of firepower that you're facing can overwhelm you. If you're facing enemies that just have a high damage output, like the eye-beams from ogres, or boomer knights, or even hive wizards, they can melt through the sword block and still kill you. Now, you also need to know that when using Stronghold, the heal will only kick in if you take damage within the very first second after blocking. So the best way to actually use Stronghold to make sure that you're getting that heal off is to toggle blocking on and off. And so if you're facing enemies that constantly fire, like most enemies in the game, you're going to want to toggle that block on and off so that you can make sure that you're getting the heal off of Stronghold. If you're fighting sniper type enemies, like Hive Acolytes or Cabal Scions, you're going to need to learn the timing of when to activate the block right before they fire their weapon. And the way you do that is by looking for a light to glow or flash on their weapons. They usually do that right before they fire. And if you're fighting enemies that space their shots, like Hive Boomer Knights, that is going to require a lot more practice, as that's something that I'm still trying to learn the block timing of, even after several weeks of using this build. The other thing you should know about Stronghold's heal trigger is that it can also trigger off of environmental damage. So if you quickly block before stepping in Vex Milk or from the fire from a Hive Acolyte grenade, you can also use that to heal yourself. Next, we're going to talk about how to actually use the Throne Cleaver sword. And depending on whether you're using the counterattack or on-guard version, your gameplay style is going to vary slightly. Now, typically when I'm running this build, I use the sword as my primary damage dealer for any enemy. I'm running around with the sword, killing red bar enemies, killing orange bar enemies with it, and sword ammo is not a problem because of how well Sword Ammo Finder and Sword Scavenger work together. Now, I would say that the counterattack version is a little bit better than the on-guard version for fighting general enemies because with Stronghold, you're going to be blocking quite a lot for the heal. And so that if you have the counterattack version, you're generally going to be running around with a 50% damage buff on that sword all the time. However, I will say that the on guard version is slightly easier to use when going for a boss kill or a champion kill, because you don't have to wait to be damaged to activate the buff. And so basically, when I use this build and I use Thrown Cleaver, I pretty much have the sword out all the time, unless I'm dealing with an enemy that I can't kill with the sword or easily hit with the sword, or if I'm specifically using my primary to regenerate my grenade. And now we want to talk about how to actually use this sword when you're taking on a high health enemy. There is a small amount of setup that's necessary when you want to use Thrown Cleaver to eliminate a boss or a champion. To make sure that you have the Shattering Blade perk activate, you want to have between 1 to 4 ammo left on your sword, and that's particularly why I encourage running around using the sword to kill enemies, because you want to be using that ammo up. You don't want to be sitting on a high ammo count, because then otherwise before you take the champion down, you're going to have to waste the ammo. Now generally, because of how well Sword Ammo Finder and Sword Scavenger work, I usually have more than enough ammo than I need before I take down a boss or a champion, but typically I have around maybe 15 to 20 ammo left, and then it's only a couple of heavy swings to get down to the ammo count that I need to activate Shattering Blade. And so what you're going to want to do, if you're using the counterattack version, is block as you're approaching the boss or champion, and the champion will probably either be shooting at you or other enemies will be shooting at you. When you see that counterattack buff appear on the side of your screen, that's when you're going to want to throw your Oppressive Darkness Grenade while you're still maintaining the block, and then follow up with the Heavy Sword Slam. If you're fighting against a boss, you're going to want to run up with the sword and block. The boss will try and stomp you. You will negate the block with the sword, the stomp with the sword block, and then you throw your Oppressive Darkness Grenade and follow with the Heavy Sword Slam. Now, if you're using the on-guard version of the sword, you're going to want to have another weapon out. You'll want to use cover to approach the boss or champion to avoid taking damage on your way in. When you get within sword range, you throw your grenade first, and then follow with the Heavy Sword Slam. And so if you've executed this combo correctly with one of the other versions of the sword, the boss or champion should be dead. Because you will deal generally over 100,000 damage. If you have any personal buffs in addition, you'll do well over 150,000 damage. I've also seen sometimes doing somewhere around 215,000 damage, depending on the level of activity that I'm doing and how many buffs I have. Now it's important to note that there are some limitations to this build, and obviously raid bosses and enemies with similar health pools to raid bosses cannot be one hit, and this build is also affected by damage scaling. And so in Destiny 2, if you're underleveled for an activity, the enemies will take less damage from your weapons. So an enemy in a 950 Nightfall and an enemy in a 980 Nightfall, like a champion, will have the same amount of health, 100,000. But the damage that you're going to deal to them is going to differ based on your power level. If you're a 960, between a 960 and a 970 Guardian, you'll be dealing more damage to those 950 champions and dealing less damage to the 980s. So for example, my Titan, that I have above 970 light level, I can one-hit barrier champions in 950 activities without the use of an Oppressive Darkness Grenade, just with the Sword Slam alone. But I need that grenade in order to one-hit barrier champions in 980 activities. For 950 Overload champions or Unstoppable champions, I need the grenade in order to be able to one-hit them. And at 980 power level, I can't one-hit those enemies with just the sword and the Oppressive Darkness Grenade. I need a personal buff, like Weapons of Light or Well of Radiance. I need some kind of personal buff to go in with, in addition to the sword perks and the Oppressive Darkness Grenade, in order to be able to one-hit those champions. So if you're running content at that level, at the 980 level, you probably already are running with a team, so it's best to coordinate with them so that they can stun the champions and add enough damage to enable you to take down the champions, or to buff you so that you can take down the champions. Now, let's get into the recommended subclass. So Top Tree Sentinel is my preferred choice, and the main reason behind that is the Weapons of Light buff from Ward of Dawn. That buff is a 35% damage buff. It can boost your damage to ridiculous numbers, like I mentioned. You'll hit for well over 200,000 with the proper setup. And the other thing is that the Defensive Strike melee ability grants you an overshield on melee kills, and that's really useful to allow you to tank damage on approach to a boss or to a champion, and really pairs well with the close quarter style of the build. If you're facing too many enemies and you're not going to be able to time the block on Stronghold appropriately, you can swap off the sword and get your melee punch off, and that gives you an overshield to heal you so that you can start slashing away with the sword again. Now I will say that Middle Tree Sentinel can function with this build. The resupply perk from Middle Tree will grant you grenade and melee energy when you kill enemies that were previously damaged by your void abilities, so you do have the potential to generate debuff grenades faster with Middle Tree Sentinel than Top Tree. However, you're going to be missing out on Ward of Dawn, the Weapons of Light buff that you get from Ward of Dawn, and the Overshield from Defensive Strike, so those are definite drawbacks to using Middle Tree. I don't recommend using Bottom Tree Sentinel. The super doesn't synergize with the build at all, and the disorient and suppression effect from the shield bash melee ability doesn't affect bosses or champions, and those are two of the primary targets of this build. So I really don't think Bottom Tree has a place with Excalibur Titan. And the last thing we want to touch on is stats. As a PvE build, recovery is always going to be your best friend. That's always going to be your most important stat, so you're going to want to prioritize that over mobility or resilience. And like I mentioned previously, the grenade is the critical part of your damage output. You will need that oppressive darkness debuff a lot of the time when you're going for sword kills on champions or on bosses. So stacking discipline as high as you possibly can to make sure that you're regenerating those grenades quickly is also important. I will say that intellect is secondarily important because you also benefit heavily from Ward of Dawn and the Weapons of Light buff. But I do not consider strength to be important to this build at all, so don't worry about that stat. Now, mastering the use of Stronghold and getting used to being able to take advantage of its perks is really the whole point of this build. It's really the whole point of going out to look for a strong sword like Throne Cleaver, is to just give us an excuse to run Stronghold because you can do things with this exotic that you really can't do with any other exotic in the game. And hopefully the background footage does a good job of showing off the many ways that you can use this exotic, whether it's protecting your teammates, whether it's for being able to cover yourself and tank damage while you pull off a risky revive, or whether it's to heal yourself when you're low and when you're critical. This is an exotic that I feel really makes my Titan into a tank and really allows me to play the way that I feel Titans should play in PvE. If you've made it this far into the build video, thanks for watching, and as always, feedback and suggestions are much appreciated and always welcome. Titan mains, I hope that this build guide has done you all justice, and I hope to see some of you out there trying this build out, because Stronghold is a game-changing exotic. The way that you can tank damage and protect your teammates is unparalleled, and really this is the only exotic of its kind in the game. And it'll really change the way that you play as a Titan. So I highly encourage you to get out there and try it even before you get the sword if you have not gotten the drop yet. Try out the Stronghold exotic, practice with the sword blocking mechanics, and really see how much damage you can tank and how well you can protect your allies from damage. So thanks for watching. Likes and subscribes are always appreciated, and I hope to see you guys in the next one.